tears aren't coming. The tears just aren't coming.
Okay.
Just to be clear, it looks like he's dead or he is dead.
It just looks like he's dead. He's got, like, blue paint on him or something. But he's going to be fine.
What is wrong with you?
Doctor!
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and I've been having fun on the channel doing these comic book retrospectives. And if you're not watching those, I'm going to say that you're missing out. But along the way, Joe and Eric Breen, who joined me, we talk about a lot of comic book history. And one of the things that came up when we were talking about the recent DC stuff we were doing with Flash was DC used to be absolutely afraid to put number one on a comic book issue. They were releasing a new series. They didn't even want the number on there because they didn't think they thought it would turn readers away, and there would be no confidence in the title. And I was just wondering, kind of what happened. Did publishers change? Did readers change? Is it both? And I thought I would bring on my good friend from the Comics by Perch podcast. Perch, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on. This is a great topic.
There's been a long time between what we were talking about, upwards of like 60, 70 years, and a lot of things change. We do know from the analysis that you've done as far as your sales numbers that keeping a run going does instill confidence, and the numbers die off a little. The attrition is slower. So we do have some empirical evidence that readers themselves still feel more confident about an ongoing run with larger numbers. Yet the publishers themselves keep rebooting and doing, especially Marvel, whenever they have an event, they try to push out as many number one issues as possible. Is it a conflict of interest? Is it multiple audiences? How did this happen?
I mean, I think it's a lot of, I've thought about this a lot. I think it comes down to a lot of very short-term thinking. And I think that the comic publishers have learned kind of these very short-term negative lessons, which is you're judged by what's happening now, not what happens over time. So if you get a high number one issue, if you can kind of spike these sales and you can say, look, my comic was the number one comic of the month, or even my comic was in the top 10 of the month. It was a number one launch and we were able to do that. That's what people notice. And they're really not paying attention or judging or caring what happens 4 issues later. It doesn't matter the way. And if you kind of look at how editorial has a number of different titles under them, it seems like there's always focus to get one title into that top 10 or one title to spike. And after that happens, you move on to the next book you want to get to spike up, and nothing else matters. Nobody is coming around, and you're not hearing this praise for saying, hey, you grew sales. Hey, your title dropped a little bit after the speculators went away, but then you went right back up and passed your number one issue because you gained a new audience. Nobody is really caring about that. There's not praise for that. There doesn't seem to be incentive for that. And I've asked editors this, and it's like, well, nobody cares. As long as you're managing the line, nobody cares. It's about getting those initial bumps. So if that's the reinforcement you're getting at work, and if that's kind of what you're judged on, then that's where you steer all your attention. And in many cases, the ongoing titles are an annoyance. I mean, those are things you want to almost get rid of as soon as you can and go back to rebooting them to get that brief spike. Maybe it's not unlike a dopamine hit on social media. You get some very short-term benefit, and then you're done.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy because we see at DC Comics, at least with the Batman title, and Batman might be an anomaly, might be a little bit of an outlier because it is the most consistent seller between either of the publishers, is that James Tynion has kind of been able to spike sales and generate new interest and bring in the speculators that you mentioned. The publishers certainly are catering to by introducing new characters, sometimes not announcing it beforehand and causing kind of a frenzy, and which I think is a little bit damage to the market because the readers might not actually get to read the comic book that they want, or the collector might not get the comic, although collectors likely have pulls. But by announcing it, it certainly garners more interest. So I think you can probably cater to both audiences.
For sure. I don't. Well, I mean, what's funny is it's like you said. There's plenty of evidence that say you don't need to do this, and there's plenty of evidence that says it's destructive. One thing we're seeing with the relaunches is it's taking more variant covers, more incentives, and more propping up in order to get the same kind of numbers you had before. So, the number one relaunches of 2015 through 2017 were averaging higher than the number one relaunches of today. So in return, we've got, instead of 20 variant covers, we got 30 variant covers, or we have, we're going to tie it into this event or that. And it's this this kind of, I take it as it's impending doom, because it's just putting more and more baggage on this system that's unhealthy. Meanwhile, like you said, Batman is a good example. Detective Comics continues to truck along. I mean, even there, you've got a new writer, and she is causing at least an initial sales bump by just starting a new arc. And this is how comics work for decades, where if the sales were slumping, you put on a new creative team, you start a new arc, you advertise a new arc, you don't change the numbering, you don't do gimmicks, you just say, bold new story, and sales go up. Maybe you have your flagship title and you say, let's bring Jeff Loeb and Jim Lee on this thing for 12 issues, and sales double. I mean, it's not that, that's what the audience expects. It's what they respond to. And these other gimmicks are very fake, and they're destructive over time.
So there is a run over at Marvel that's, it's gone on for a little while. It's Chip Zdarsky and Marco Cicchetto on Daredevil with the few fill-in artists. Every once in a while you get a fill-in artist for a story guide. Now, they did not announce beforehand that Elektra was going to be the new Daredevil.
Right.
That likely cost them sales. That would have generated an increase in as far as speculators. People wanted to kind of come in and check out who the new Daredevil was. So I think, there's opportunities here and there, but I think they have the blinders on to like ongoings, and they're so focused on these new characters, new relaunches, that they have an opportunity to really generate interest in a good series that is high quality, and they just kind of miss the boat.
Well, sure. I think that their marketing engine is really tuned to number one launches is what matters. If it's they know how to market a new comic. They know how to market a new relaunch. They do not know how to market a storyline update or a shocking development. And so they don't. The sales did get a bump when Elektra was introduced as Daredevil and all these. And it was equivalent to a new storyline, a new creative team coming in and doing something new with the book, and interest came in. Now, if they'd applied a little bit of marketing, it would have done much better. They left a lot of money on the table, but marketing at this point, the press releases and everything they do is all geared toward number one issues. And you could see it for yourself if you pick up Marvel previews, or you pick up the not the solicitations that like you and I might go through, but the actual thing that is delivered to the shop. Every full page, every big piece of promotion in that is for a new number one issue. They don't promote storylines. It is, even right now they're doing the Spider-Man Sinister storyline, and it's, if you look at, they promote the kind of the alpha issue, they promote some of the other things around it. The actual ongoing series is kind of relegated to a split page. They definitely have a way they do it, and the way they do it is not working. But again, I don't know if anybody is analyzing or caring. I don't know if anybody at Marvel or DC are saying, hey, the results you're getting are much worse than what you used to get. The spin to value is lower. It's just, I don't think anybody is really doing that analysis for them, and so I think they're just kind of doing it the way they've always done it, and here's where we are. But the indies, we've talked about this before too. Walking Dead consistently grew its audience over its lifespan. Saga has grown its audience over its lifespan. There's tons of comics that show you how it's done. This is really unnecessary.
And even Spawn, which
Sure.
hit number 300, is the longest ongoing indie series in history. It did have an attrition, but then it had a steady regrowth, and the sales are quite good. I believe it's the number one selling Image series. It's in the top 2 or 3 if it's not.
Yeah, without the bumps. I mean, you're always going to, if you launch a new number one issue and you have a hot creative team on it, it's going to sell well. But that would almost be my argument to market it less. I mean, if right now at Marvel, Donny Cates gets put on a new book and he launches number one, sure, let Donny Cates go. Well, something that's not going to reboot. Let's say Donny Cates comes up with who knows, the God of Light, and it's a new Venom way we're going to call that, whatever. His name and who he brings with him are going to bring sales. You could still market it, but it's far less important than, say, marketing Elektra becoming Daredevil, or marketing, even though I'm going to hate the storyline, marketing the World War She-Hulk kind of stuff. I mean, when you're doing something new in a comic, market that. That's the stuff you need to draw your readers' attention to. The number ones and the big creator launches, they're going to be fine. And again, as we've seen at Image, Scott Snyder goes over and does Noctera. You don't need to market that heavily. You've got Tony Daniels, you've got Scott Snyder. Both people know those guys. It's a new issue. The attention will come. Spend some of that money and effort on your existing stories so you keep the ongoing comics alive.
Yeah. So what do you think? I'll call it, what's the original sin? Where did this all take place at? It feels like maybe it was during the 90s speculator boom where essentially publishers realized, oh my goodness, all these old comics, obviously, that we're not selling anymore are worth all this money. We're missing out on our piece of the pie. We need to make comics that are just as rare but are new. Is that where it all began?
For me, yes. I mean, I think there's a lot of debate about this topic, but I do think the 90s were what caused it. It was very tempting for people to launch number one issue. I think the initial Image launches taught, several of the publishers, weirdly, I think taught Marvel the worst lessons. It taught them the exact opposite of what they should learn. And to minimize the artist and to put a lot of focus into a number one, that's what they saw. They saw, like, Rob Liefeld go over with Extreme Studios and he gets Brigade going, it's Youngblood going, and several others, and they're like, wow, look at all those number ones and the big sales, so we should do that too. So why are we propping up this comic on issue 423? Let's have a new number one issue and get a piece of that. I think that's where a lot of it began. It's one of the areas. I know there's a lot of people listen to both of our channels who love the 90s because that's where they entered comics. But for me, that is my feeling. It is that the 90s brought a lot of gimmicks, and it brought a lot of relaunches, and it brought a lot of very short-term wins at the expense of the long-term. And I think now we're seeing that play out. Weirdly, in the early 2000s, it felt like comic companies were coming back from the brink, that the Ultimate Comics line and several other things that both companies were doing were trying to step away from maybe some of the excess of the 90s. But then a few years later, they went all in, and it's terrible. I think it's self-destructive, and I think we're seeing a very bad consequence of it.
It's kind of crazy if you go back to that time when they, not every time, but a few of the times when they were doing variant covers, it was because the print orders were so enormous that there wasn't a printer that could, traditional printer at the time with the technology they had, that could not print all of, like, X-Men number one. So ended up having to have 4 different covers because it was printed in 4 different batches and delivered in 4 different weeks.
Yeah,
and,
a creative solution around logistics as opposed to a way to. It was a different time, and I think, again, it's. I'm not trying to say let's get rid of all the variants. I mean, some people like them; it's fine. It's just, the question is, do we need 40 variants? I mean, is how much is just ludicrous at some point. I mean, if it's what the market will bear, cool. But do you need to relaunch every year? We've already seen a couple comics now that have relaunched within the same calendar year. Are we moving to a place where they're going to relaunch, 3 in a year? We're about to get a new Miss Marvel number one. Why are we getting that? I think there's a bunch of very strange choices that, again, you look at the numbers and none of it pencils out as a good business decision.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. I think, like, X-Force, I think, rebooted and had 2 number ones in 2019. Uncanny X-Men, X-Men, 2 number ones, I believe, in 2019 as well. It's a lot of weird stuff. Like, those are major titles. You wouldn't think that you would need to do that with those franchises. And with what you were talking about earlier, with so many of these ongoings kind of just left, like, almost flapping in the wind, so they can concentrate on all these reboots. Well, what happens when you let an ongoing just atrophy and kind of fall out of the conscience of the readers? You have to reboot more, and you have to reboot more, and that's why you're seeing the diminishing returns. I mean, in June, I'm certain that you noticed it. Mm-hmm. There are 5 events at Marvel Comics.
Yeah,
Hellfire Gala, Heroes Are Born. Well, the War Bounty Hunters, I guess that's Star Wars kind of only thing. Infinite Destinies, which might be Infinite Fury, I'm not really sure. And then there's that Spider-Man Chameleon Conspiracy.
Right. Yeah.
Where's the room for any of them to breathe? How are any of those events going to stand out when they're just clumped there?
Well, they're just moving the problem. I mean, Marvel's moving to a place where there will be an event of some form every month, at least one. And like you said, in many cases, it's going to be upward of 5. Every line, whether it's the Spider-Man line, the Avengers line, the X line, will have an event. We're getting the Hellfire Gala now. In October, we get another X-Men event. The challenge is all you're doing is you're changing the problem. You're saying we used to have a bunch of ongoing series. We weren't sure how to market them and how to get attention, and so we use this gimmick to kind of push attention onto events and relaunches. Well, now that you've got so many events and relaunches, once again, you're people are going to lose focus of what you're doing, and so now what are you going to do? What's the next gimmick that you're going to pull out? And I do think we're headed for a period where we're going to get bagged comics again. We're going to get trading cards. We're going to get holo covers. We're going to get all that stuff in the next couple of years. We're going to get shock deaths. It's
3D covers, right?
It's all going NFTs. Well, maybe not that one, but we're going to get all. We're just going to get all this stuff. It's a cycle, and the crazy part about it is if you take the long game. And it depends on what you're in for. If you're a publisher that's trying to stay in business for decades and you just look at your line, the answer is there. Again, Walking Dead has done it. Lots of titles have done it. If you just invest in a book, it grows over time. Invincible is a title that started pretty small and grew steadily over its life to be a very healthy title. Now it's an Amazon series and the trade paperbacks are impossible to keep in stock. That's a healthy business. Like, why wouldn't you want that business? And this is where I feel like Marvel and maybe to some extent DC are at odds with their parent company. I know a lot of people say, well, they're not paying any attention. But the reality is, you have Mark Millar, who's about to launch Jupiter's Legacy, and he's got his titles, and that's going to be a very tight synergy with the shows. You've got Invincible and The Boys over at Amazon, and that's a very healthy relationship at this point. Marvel has their shows, and they're popular. The MCU is, of course, very, very popular. And there is an expectation that the comic books will be able to either feed that or be a piece of that, like they are for everybody else. All the other, and I do think there comes a time or comes a moment where Kevin Feige says, why is it that all these indies have a much better connection with the shows that they're doing? And it's a nice, harmonious relationship. And over here, we have an Avengers team that's unrecognizable from what we're doing on TV. And we have characters like none of this. And you guys are rebooting and restarting constantly. None of this makes sense. Now, some of your listeners may say that comics don't make any money. Nobody's really going to care. Maybe, but we're seeing that they're carrying over with what Kirkman is doing. We're seeing that they're carrying in other places. So I'm not so sure that Marvel just escapes this as being, well, it's too small. Nobody's really going to pay attention. People are caring about smaller companies than Marvel right now.
Just to add on to your point, we've talked a bit about manga sales and, the rising wave of manga in North America. It's almost kind of taking over in some respects. Certainly has captured a generation, unfortunately, that the traditional Western comics, superhero comics haven't. And one of the things that has been said multiple times, I've heard it from multiple different people in multiple settings, if you go and watch the anime, and the story's over. It's not over because you go to the manga and they're so closely tied together that you can seamlessly walk in and continue reading your story.
Yeah. Well, and I absolutely. And I also think that, one of the things that doesn't get said enough is that anime and the popularity of some of the shows absolutely drives manga. There's been a couple recent reports and things that show that My Hero Academia, which is a massively selling book, that manga is very popular. The majority of customers outside of Japan are finding it through anime. They're watching the cartoon and then they're going to the books and then they get excited because the books are ahead of the anime and it creates this wonderful cycle. That lesson is, again, clearly going to get tossed around of, hey, the shows are feeding the books. The books are a pretty good business. That's going to happen in the US as well. And I think, again, Feige made some comments about how surprised and pleased he was that during WandaVision, people were speculating on who some of the mystery characters were and where it was going. And they were going to the comics and they were researching all this. They like that. It's brand attachment. And if they turn around and the brand is completely out of sync with the show and everything that they're doing, they're going to fix that.
And that's one of the things about your production cycle for a movie, which takes much longer, or a TV show, which is shorter but still longer. It has to end. You have to have a break. You have to go restart your production cycle. If you have the books and they're closely related, your viewers can't just walk away. They have something to kind of keep them occupied until the next season, and they can get right back in there. And you're right, there's none of that synergy. Even the DC animated stuff, which I think is superior to what Marvel does, they change all the stories. They change characters out.
Yeah.
All the time.
No, absolutely. This is something that won't last. Just like the gimmick covers and all the rest. I mean, it is self-defeating. We're seeing an increasing lower returns based off this strategy. I know that's painful for comic fans who just wish it would change tomorrow. I mean, I'm not having fun, waiting it out while, the industry figures it out, but the industry will. This will change. It's probably going to be very painful, and we're going to lose a lot of things on the way, but it won't last forever. And I do think people should, at least have some patience that, and when I say patience, I don't mean shut up and consume everything and it will get better eventually. I mean that these things do work themselves out. History shows it works themselves out. It just means we're living through a particular painful time right now.
Couldn't agree more, my friend Ed. Thank you so much for joining me today. Had a really great conversation, and I'll talk to you later.
Take care.